All right, welcome to another installment of Lessons in Leviticus. Now, as we've been going through the book of Leviticus, bouncing around quite a bit, we've been looking through some of the many laws and sacrifices in Leviticus. But what I want to do today is take a minute to address some sort of a big question about how or if these laws in Leviticus apply to us as Christians today. Do they apply to us? Should we follow them? Any of them? None of them? Why? Now, these are incredibly important questions for Christians to understand because I have personally heard massive confusion over this from non-Christians or even critics in my own life who think that Christians are just sort of cherry picking individual Bible verses because they don't follow everything in the Bible. But I've also heard Christians who are just simply genuinely confused about this as well. What do we do with these laws today? Why don't we follow them? Why do we expect Christians to follow some but not all? And I'll just be honest, I've heard that numerous times. Just for example, thinking in different parts of my life, I remember hearing that specific issue from a speaker that came to my high school. I remember hearing it very clearly from a teenager when I was a youth pastor, and just recently I saw it again in a rerun of a TV show and numerous other times in my life. And I've heard very specifically this come out over a hot button issue in our culture today, that it comes out a lot when a critic will say something like, you say homosexual behavior is wrong, but you eat pork. You obviously don't follow the Bible. And as I said, I've heard that just off the top of my head. I remember a high school speaker saying that. I remember a teenager telling it to me as a youth pastor, and I did in fact see it in a TV show recently. And both of those laws about not eating pork and homosexual behavior being sin are both found in Leviticus. So this is a very common question, or at times accusation, that comes up around a controversial topic of the Bible's teaching on homosexual behavior. So what do we do with these laws themselves? And the short answer is this. We as Christians are under the new covenant, so we obey the laws renewed there. Since we are under the new covenant, we obey what is renewed in the New Testament. So in the case of, say, eating pork, which is a law in Leviticus, and we'll talk about that on another day, in the New Testament, we see explicitly stated that all food is clean. So we no longer have to worry about food making us unclean ritually, as if that's something we're supposed to follow. We are specifically told that we should not follow the food laws and that all food is clean. So we are being faithful to Scripture when we no longer follow that law. On the other hand, when it comes to the hot button issue of homosexual behavior, it is specifically identified in the New Testament as sinful. Jesus excludes the practice when he defines marriage as between a man and a woman. Paul and Jude speak against it as being contrary to God's design. So we are following the Bible when we uphold that principle. So we don't follow Old Testament laws because they're in the Old Testament. We follow what is renewed in principle or in specifics in the New Testament. So, this is important, we don't follow the Ten Commandments because Exodus or Deuteronomy says so, but we see in the New Testament that they're in various ways are renewed, and so we follow them because they are renewed in the New Testament, not just because Exodus says so. So I will say Christians should stop saying things like, homosexual behavior is wrong because Leviticus says so. Now, the moral principle is correct, but we don't follow it because Leviticus says so. We see it in the creation order, in the very fabric of the world that God created. We see that in the New Testament, Jesus and other writers of the New Testament renew the principle that sexual expression is to be reserved exclusively for a marriage between a man and a woman. And we follow what is renewed in the new covenant that guides us, the New Testament, the new covenant. And it is absolutely consistent for us to do that. Now, different laws in the Old Testament. Traditionally, people like John Calvin, though it goes back beyond him, he didn't originate the idea, have identified within the Old Testament three main categories of laws. There's moral law, there's ceremonial or ritual law, a lot of that is in Leviticus, and there's judicial or civil law. So there's moral, ritual, and civil laws. So moral laws, the teaching goes, moral laws never change. It's always wrong to murder. Old Testament, New Testament, it's always wrong to murder. Ceremonial laws, on the other hand, things like ritual purity, animal sacrifices, these ritual laws are actually specifically undone in the New Testament. Because of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, they are specifically removed. So they should not be followed. The moral laws must be followed. The ceremonial and ritual laws must not be followed. But then there's also a category of these civil laws, and these are laws that were specifically used to govern ancient Israel, a specific group of people, specific nation. And there may be principles that may be applied for us today, but the laws themselves might be helpful, they might not. They may be about something that doesn't apply to us in any way, shape, or form. They might be incorporated by a certain government if they fit, but they might not. And so the laws themselves fit in different categories, and the different categories should be kept or not kept or used optionally as is appropriate. And the church has typically recognized such a distinction. Some must be continued. They're renewed in the New Testament. Some are specifically done away with, and then some are left open for governments to decide on. And so it's very important for us to understand that these laws should neither all be followed nor should all of them be put aside. It's far more nuanced than that, and that's hard for us sometimes. But an honest and faithful reading of the Bible as a whole shows us that we must follow God's moral law, that we must not continue the sacrificial laws, and that we may incorporate some of the others into our civil laws if they're fitting. Now, one last thing, very briefly. I also want us to see that in the New Testament, while the morality is upheld, the extreme punishments are eliminated. So, for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul brings up a situation in the church involving a sexual relationship that should not be approved, should not be happening. Now, in the Old Testament law, people who did this should be executed. That's the punishment prescribed in the law. But Paul shows that the morality continues, and he makes very clear that this behavior must not continue and must not be accepted. It is completely unacceptable and must stop. But he does not expect them to enact the punishment. The morality has not changed, but the response has. And so as Christians, it is entirely consistent for us to uphold the moral teaching of the Bible, to discontinue the sacrifices and the food laws, and at the same time, not expect any of the harsh sentences on those who break the moral laws because of the mercy and grace that we have in Jesus. It is faithful and consistent for us to read the Bible this way, to obey what Jesus commands, to follow what is renewed in our covenant, while at the same time learning about God and the way that he's revealed himself to us, even in laws that we're specifically not supposed to follow anymore. So I hope that's helpful in reading through Leviticus and looking at Old Testament laws and how we understand them in sort of a grand scheme of what we do with these laws. So I hope that's helpful, and I hope I've given some concrete examples to help make sense of it as we move forward together. So I look forward to seeing you tomorrow for another lesson in Leviticus.